Good afternoon and welcome to Sihasin Hour. We're glad to have you guys here with us today. And we have quite a panel here of special guests who are going to talk to us about preparing for the planting season. And as we know here on the Navajo Nation and also across the Hopi Nation, we come from quite of a tradition of farming, irrigation, dry farming. We are farmers and agriculturalists who grow corn and squash and watermelons, and so we just wanted to explore this topic today and give some of our viewers a chance to ask any questions they might have regarding optimizing their fields as we move forward, and also just to listen to some of our special guests' presentations on what you can do to start your fields, and looking at time frames in terms of growing certain crops, etc. So by way of introduction, Mahayo Twitch Eatni Nishlan, since the Kotni Bashichin, Omaha Edasha Cherokee Edashanale. I'm from Chinle, Arizona, and happy to be here with you guys. I live in St. Michael's, but I'm from Chinle. So I'm going to go ahead and let our special guests introduce themselves, and we'll start with Benita first. And then we'll have Darrell introduce himself. So Benita, if you could introduce yourself, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, it's she Benita Litson and she do Sanjakin and Shlon touching me Bashashin. Ia Ani Edashachedo, Tototi Edashanella, Aro Te Lido a Yisi Nasha, Aro Aqua and Nashnish Dine College. But I've been working here at Dine College for the past 16 years as the land grant director, offering extension and outreach services to farmers and ranchers throughout the Navajo Nation, trying to hone in on key concerns that they might have and figuring out ways to deliver workshops or educational opportunities out to farmers and ranchers. Another big focus is trying to get the youth involved and learning a little bit more about agriculture and having them be future decision makers. So with that, thank you for inviting us to be presenting today.
Darrell Yazzie Jr. and she had Twitch in and Shed Hotoni Bashin, Hashka Andoni Eda Shiado Kinyan Edashinale, Lay Hota Nasha out the Shaganet Eda out the Shiyaho Ato. And then I'm Darrell Yazzie Jr. I work with the Nakal Land Grant Office. I'm the extension agent going on 3.5 years now, close to 4. And I kind of cover the Southwest region of the Navajo Nation in planting, livestock husbandry, and then kind of in the area of range land management. So thank you for offering this workshop and inviting us as well.
Awesome, you're welcome. Really appreciate you guys both making time to be here. Before we get into Darrell's presentation, I just wanted to ask just a couple of questions, and maybe you guys can both respond accordingly. I'm wondering, just for you both personally, did you grow up around agriculture? And how old were you when you started, learning about planting crops in fields? And we'll go ahead and let Darrell answer first on this one.
Yeah, so I've been kind of actively growing for the past 5 years. Prior to my family kind of has a little orchard field. And prior to that, I've heard that my grandparents were also planters themselves. But when I was small, that wasn't really included, I guess, only because like a lot of my grandparents were up in age, and how that goes. But it's always been in the back of my mind of trying to start it up again. And so for the past recent years, when I was an intern with land grant office and then going into like an extension agent, being one of the staff members there, I wanted to kind of boost my actual planting experience. And so a lot of that was kind of came from working at LGO and being exposed to different type of planting areas and being able to work with older, growers themselves. And so working with a lot of producers. And so, yeah, and currently I have a little 100 by 150 foot little plot that I have at home that I'm working on. And so I grow a lot of different things in there. I try not to focus on one, only because I'm looking at the whole idea of food forest and what that can look like. And so I cover a lot of crops from corn to squash to beans to peas to leafy greens like kale, lettuce, chard, and all that good stuff. And just trying to find out how to best grow them in conditions that we have here on the reservation, but also not only that, like, what harvesting looks like, and then the best practices, and then finally, what recipes would look like. So that's something that, as far as growing, that's me.
That's awesome. Wow. And it's interesting to know that that you're able to grow and harvest things like, some of the leafy greens, because
Mhm.
we all know that those are super healthy to our diets, and just being able to grow them here on the Navajo Nation is awesome. And
Yeah.
incorporating them into recipes, like you're saying, is great as well. Benita, maybe you can tell us a little bit about if you had grown up around agriculture, and just maybe when you started to learn about planting and farming.
Yes. Uh, so I have been involved in agriculture probably from day one. So that's actually my passion. My passion is actually working with livestock, cattle and horses. Just recently, sheep, as I moved back to the reservation, I can't say recently, 16 years ago, to try to get my kids involved in understanding how to raise livestock. So we're all of the above. And also, on the farming side, my family has always only grown mostly hay for forage, additional forage for our livestock. We've had small gardens like corn, squash, the main traditional foods that we continually grow. We had, I want to say small, but they're actually about an acre, a little over an acre, dryland farming near our home. And so I have been involved in farming from wee little bit, being a tiny child. I remember irrigating when the water was running too fast for us to stop as little kids, and we would try to make some makeshift things to kind of slow water down so it doesn't kind of go through the field. And we couldn't, the mud was heavy, and trying to block the water before it busts the water. So things like that. It was fun growing that, but it's a huge eye opener when your parents transfers the land or probably the permit to you, because now you become the decision maker of when to plant, how to plant, and learning all of these items that you never really were involved with from the start. You've always participated in planting and being a part of that, but you never, we're a part of the why this date and why this particular crop. What does our soil look like? When you're a child, you never really think of that, but now that you take on that responsibility, you definitely need to do some research and also learn what works, asking your parents or your grandparents why it has been done this way. And sometimes their answers are correct, years of experience, because of the frost, because of, how hot it is or how windy it gets. These are the reasons why they choose to grow certain things in different regions on the Navajo Nation. So really trying to reach out to those that have already been doing the work longer, and kind of understanding the whys, why things occur a certain way. So that has been very, very helpful for me. I myself and my family, we raise cattle, and so we do grass-fed beef, and we retail that out. So our biggest thing that we grow is grass hay or a variety of hay so that we can continue to feed our livestock throughout the winter months, because our rangelands don't quite have enough forage for our livestock. So that's what we have been involved with. I myself, I keep saying I don't really own my animals. I sort of pushed it off to my kids. I only have 3 boys, so each of them have responsibility with working with their, whether it's sheep, their cattle, or their horses, and any profits made or anything that's made goes back to them. And so they're able to manage that dollar amount that they make on their own. So that's something I have been trying to get them a little more involved, so that when they become permit holders or land use holders, they're a little bit more knowledgeable about making those decisions. So that's kind of what my background has been. Thank you.
Great. Wow, that sounds really awesome. And it does sound like it's been something that has been handed down within your family, to continue to work your fields, and even extending it into livestock and ranching, and continuing to feed the animals or your livestock during the winter months. It's just all about planning and looking ahead and preparing. And that's really what we wanted to talk about today, is where we're at right now in the growing season, and what we can be doing, how we can look at our fields and start to get things planted, or at least preparing. But I know that Darrell has a presentation for us today, and so let's go ahead and dive into that. And just before we do, if any of our viewers, please feel free to put your comments in the comments section, questions in the comments section, comments as well. But I do see we have a few already. We'll address those after we get through the presentation. Darrell does have a slide at the end where we'll start to address questions. So Darrell, you can take it away. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you again. And so this presentation is kind of meant for individuals who are beginning, or just looking at, what they need to look at as far as like what information is needed. So this is kind of like a calendar type of planning process, but it relates to garden planting season. So what type of garden are you doing? So there's a lot of like different types of accessibility that people have, but also that's based on time, availability, and your resources. So you can do something small like I am doing. It's less than half an acre. Well, I should say less than a fourth of an acre, but I grow a pretty good amount, and it covers my whole family, and we're a family of like 3 to 4. And so, yeah, so what type of garden would you like? 1 acre or less? If it's a field, how big, and when did it last grow in it? If it was, dormant, what are your amending practices? Meaning, what do you do to put nutrients back in the soil? And those types of practices will help you determine, how much load work you need to do to actually restart it or keep going at it. Or if you have access to a hoop house, that's another thing too. All these 3 things have different necessities and needs. So really looking at those structures and layouts will really determine like what type of gardening you can actually do based on your time and availability. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna go back. So I guess methods of gardening, there's like a lot of different types of gardening that you can do out there. And it just like comes back to the time and availability that you have. And also the labor. A lot of that really comes back down to labor. So if you have an acre of like 2 to 3 acres, you're not going to be doing a whole permaculture garden in it, because permaculture is really focusing on small areas and boosting the amount of fertility in the soil by doing a lot of digging and putting different layers of soil, organic matter, and water in the same area. But if you're looking at a whole plot of an acre or more, that's something that you're going to want to think about. I mean, it's possible, it's just going to take longer. And then there's like native gardens, native type of plants. If you want to increase the native type of grass species, fauna, flora type of thing, then that's something that you can focus on, or you can do like a vegetable garden or a pollinator garden to help, the local pollinators. So there's different types of garden types of stuff that you can look out there, ideas. Where are your resources located? I think that's one of the big ones, especially when we start to look into a lot of like, soil amendments, unless you're like a 10-year type of composting that you've been doing, just holding and putting on the side. I don't think anybody did that, but that's something that a lot of people can do too. So amending kind of comes from that. Do you have enough for the year? In a sense, the growing year. So if you have enough water, what does that look like? Will you be hauling water, or is it directly from the house, into UA water? So if you have tools, shovels, rakes, and pickets and other stuff that you may need to, because sometimes when you're starting out, you really have to loosen up the soil. And if you really have hard soil or clay soil, that's a lot of compaction from over the years really starts to take play. And then, fencing, hand tools, tanks, lumber, where's your closest lumber at? How long will it take, to deliver stuff? What's their ordering service like? Maybe like what they have in as far as lumber goes, and what do they have your needs, kind of thing. And then when I'm looking at postal service, I'm kind of looking at, if you're ordering seeds online, sometimes a lot of places or online services don't really don't deliver to postal services. And so what's their alternative point of, I guess delivering? Or maybe you can have a family member that lives in a housing or NHA delivered to them, and then once it gets delivered to them, it'll be a better option. What do you what to think about on a full tank? How many trips can you do? Like if you're hauling water, like how many barrels fit with that one if you're filling it up? And how long does that take? Because some like as you get further into the season, your water needs will change, and we'll go into that as well. Do you have enough water for your garden? And not only your garden, but like your soil. You really have to keep it. Well, depending on what you're growing, you really have to keep it moisture up there. And then keep a record of your garden duties and what was done. So I think a lot of this really comes back to record keeping, and it just kind of helps you in the future of your future plannings. Like if, let's say, if you wanted to improve next year, you kind of go back to your notes or your records and see where a lot of the duties need to improve, or what can be cut back on to improve another area, and so forth. So that's something that you can do on the side. And then, yeah, so like review it for next year's garden season, and you'll change stuff. It'll be ever changing. And then another thing to look at is first and last frost dates. And so I think this is really important, especially if you're in a region of higher elevation, because a lot of the plants that we want to grow, I'm assuming a lot of people want to do the kind of like three sisters type of thing. So corn, squash, and beans. And a lot of those plants are familiar with warmer conditions. And so when is the last frost date? So if you're starting your starts inside and you're putting outside, and frost comes through, it's going to wipe it out pretty fast. And so, that's like a month in advance of labor that you had to do. And so knowing your last frost date before you start planting in the ground is really important for warm condition type of plants. And then frost dates is the start of an ending of the plant of planting seeds in the ground. And then we can go into like the areas of what warm condition type of seeds go through, and then as opposed to like cool season. This is generalized information. So what I mean by that is when you look online, this is kind of where I find out my information about first and last frost date. Just kind of looking online, saying like first and last frost date for, Clagato, Arizona, or wherever you want to grow. And it'll give you an estimation. It's not accurate to the point, but it's kind of giving you a 1 to 2 week leeway. And so you can plan around that. And then going forth, what's the difference between cool season and warm season planting? So as you see this little chart here, it kind of depicts a picture of like when plants are able to grow. And this is based on the cool season type of plants. So as you can see, they do really well at the end of like winter, and then going into spring where it gets really warm, and then it starts to get really hot again. And so a lot of these plants here don't like a lot of the the hot conditions. So they only do well in the like the meteor type of warm conditioning. But when you are talking about germination, a lot of them need cool temperatures to germinate. And so once they start producing their leaves and so forth, they do a lot better, and then they do die back. And then based on what you're growing and how you're growing it, it'll come back again, or you can replant during this phase time at the end of summer, early fall. And then you have that little short span of like warm conditions that you can still grow in. And then, so, soil temperature for this is from 35 to 65 degrees. And I'm talking about soil temperature as opposed to air temperature, because those two are two different things. So just make sure you make a note of that. Some require semi-fertile soil. I shouldn't say semi-fertile. I mean, as long as you're growing in great conditions and you're adding compost every now and then, your soil will be really fertile. So any type of growing that you do, especially if it's really compact, you need really fertile soil. And that just helps in, offering the best nutrition and, vitamins, minerals that the plants will uptake, and then, you consuming it. And then 4 to 8 hours of direct sunlight. So that's just gonna vary based on what you're planting. So a lot of times where you order your seeds or your plants from, kind of ask these questions, like where was it grown from? Are you what elevation at? Or you can look at, zones. Zones is a really big one, especially for a lot of these arid plants out here. A lot of them, and then I guess ask them like what type of soil they grew it in, because there is a difference between growing in sand to silt and then clay. And so those really differentiate the nutrients and uptake of the conditions that the plant is used to. So yeah, and then warm season is just kind of generally like I was explaining, as opposed to like the cool conditions of the year, it'll be kind of generally within like May to the end of September or early August. So soil temperature is above 50 degrees Fahrenheit for germination to properly go through the phases. Require fertile soil for proper plant growth. And so what I mean by fertile soil is it has to have enough nutrients in it. And so this is kind of something that a lot of new growers kind of see within their first year of planting in an area that has never been planted in. They'll get a really great success. Their corn will be like over 6 feet tall, and they'll have like a lot of ears of corn or squash and whatever you're growing. And so that ground that was first used for like crops prior to was never really grown in to that extent. So over the years, it's building up its organic matter, its nutrients in the soil. So that first year will kind of trick you into like saying that you did really well, only because you just put the seed in the ground, you watered it, and ta-da, like you get all of your vegetables and stuff like that. And then year two, you try to do it again the same way. But you start to notice that there's a decline in the growth patterns of the plants, and you don't get as tall or as much of a produce at the end of harvest season. And so that's where a lot of people kind of misunderstand that like nutrients has to be put back into the soil, and that's where you start to get into soil amendments. And there's different type of amendments out there. It just really depends on what you're open to, what you have available to. And then how much labor services you want to be put into it. Because there's a lot of great methods out there that require a lot of, startups of amending, but then they pay off in the long run because it's a slow process. So the faster process that you want, think about it in this way: the faster process that you put into it, the faster process it has in being depleted faster, I guess. So if you have a longer process of amending, you have a longer process of that depleting. And then generally 6 to 10 hours of direct sunlight. Some of them like, partial shade. So that's, you can do your research on what plant you're planting and kind of figure out these different needs that they need, their water needs, their sunlight needs, and the nutrition needs.
Hey, Darrell, real quick on that last slide, just wondering, what are some common types of things, nutrients that people can add to their soil to keep it fertile, as they hit, maybe the end of summer into fall?
Benita, you want to take this one?
Sure. So I think some of the things that you can do when, like you're saying, coming from fall into into winter months might be making sure you have a cover crop. So on the farmland or the garden that you're growing, maybe put in some seeds, winter seeds, either grass or either what are they called, legumes, because there's some plants that are nitrogen fixing plants, so they add nitrogen to the soil. So depending on what your soil quality might look like, or either what you're planning to grow the next season, what kind of nutrients does it require the most? And one thing to know about soils is your main soil mineral content that is depleted is your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So those are the main three that is constantly, you're either losing it quickly, using it, so you're going to have to replenish those three. Then you have micronutrients. Those are like your iron, zinc, the multiple things. Those are not depleted as much, but what we've learned, either zinc or iron is the next one when you start seeing like yellowing of the plants, things like that. So quick things to add might be, like I said, cover cropping, putting some organic matter back into your soil. So you're just going to till that back in and let that kind of like compost or decompose back into your soil, adding nutrients. Also, people do manure. So manure is also a good additive, but you want to make sure that that manure is cured first, meaning it's not fresh and hot. So it takes almost, I want to say 3 months to be safe or longer. And sometimes you're going to have to turn that because most ranchers will just pile it up. So what's in the middle is still pretty hot. So sort of like composting, you'll have to move it over or turn it over so that the outside cures or the inside cures also. So those are some things, and some folks add their own composting from maybe their household usages and having that break down, and then you can add that to your soil also. But the quick fix, if you're gonna, if you're not organically certified, you can go into the hardware store and they have fertilizer that you could add. And so there's also another workshop we can probably do about fertilization and looking at what you're purchasing, because you just think fertilizer is fertilizer, but there's numbers on it. So just a real quick, if you look at the numbers, there's usually 3 numbers on there, and that's your N, P, and K. So your first number is your N, your P, and a K. So if your N is at 10 and you need nitrogen and your K is maybe at 30, that's probably not the fertilizer you want. You probably need to look for another fertilizer that has higher N value, where it's like maybe 30. And so you just kind of have to be careful on that too, because nitrogen can definitely burn your plants too.
Wow, good to know. Good to know. Awesome. Thank you guys. And you can go ahead and keep going, Darrell, but I appreciate that that insight.
Yeah. So when Benita was talking about, adding manure as a soil amendment, I think a point that would be made is also, I think when you're adding in aged manure, it's best to do it during the fall time after your harvest season has ended, after you have collected everything and you kind of, broke down all the corn stalks or whatever was going there. You would then add in your manure here. So that way it has like about 3 to 5 months of actually composting or breaking down into the soil. So that's something to note there. So you don't want to be doing it before your planting season, because you kind of risk the possibility that it might be still active. And so that's where a lot of the nitrogen is really high into. So that's where nitrogen burning of your roots or, the root stalks can happen too. So making sure that you add in manure during the fall season, have that cure through winter, and then be ready by, late spring and then early summer. And then continuing on with my little presentation, this is just kind of a comparison of what cool crops as opposed to warm crops looks like as far as like the growing year. And so a lot of times there's not a lot that can grow during the winter unless you have a hoop house, unless you have the right conditions and or greenhouse, whatever it may be, and growing in that type of environment. Some terms to know. as far as like beginning growers. Germination is the development of a plant from a seed or spore after a period of or dormancy. So meaning it kind of breaking out of its shell of protection, and then being able to have its first leaf formation and root formation. So once you see those things, that's when you have germination. And then GMO is genetically modified organisms. So that will be determined on the source that you're getting it from. Some of them are GMO source, some of them are heirloom source, so they're more naturally modified in a sense. But yeah, and then going forward, hardening off. So this kind of goes into the area of transplanting. If you're starting your seeds indoor, and you're creating those really great conditions for the plant, you have a good moisture content, you have a good soil softness, and you have high heat, and then you don't have a lot of wind in there. So I guess really with those three things, you have a great condition for any type of plants that are growing that are really needing that warm atmosphere. So, and if you're going to be going from like indoor planting and then going outdoor and then transplanting into the ground directly, you're kind of putting it into a shock phase to where the plant is like, okay, like, it's like so wet, and then all of a sudden it's so dry, and it's like has to deal with the hot sun beating down directly. And so that's where you see a lot of wilting or even drying out of the plants automatically. So this hardening off phase is kind of between that phase of planting indoor to directly into the ground, where you're kind of pre-exposing it to the conditions outside. So that's from a 7 to 10 day period process of acclimating plants from indoor to outdoor conditions. So that's just a little information on that. And then hardiness is just like I was saying, it's going to depend on your zones. So hardiness is the degree to which the plant can withstand cold zone or cold temperatures. So if you have for instance, kale and lettuce really do well in cool conditions, as opposed to like your squash species or your corn, where they really love the warmer and hot conditions. And so if you don't know that they can kind of tolerate a little bit of coldness, then a little drop in temperature will really affect them. So that's the hardiness. And then annuals as opposed to perennials. And there's another one called biennials. Biennials are varieties that can complete their life cycle in 1 year or less. So like, for instance, a corn is annual because it goes from seed to stalk to ears to die back. And so that's the life cycle of a corn. So a corn is annual. Perennials are a lot of like your shrubs or species of plants that will come back every year. So varieties that will live for 2 or more years. Some of them will only live for 2 years for that. So that's what you call your biennials. So I forgot to put that in here, but it's kind of in between here. So biennials is kind of like the phase of a plant to get to maturity takes 2 years. So for the first year, it just kind of focuses on energy being absorbed from its leaves. And then the second year is kind of where it goes into its final phase of like production, to where it forms its crops and stuff like that. And so that's it takes 2 years to get to that point, and then it dies off. So that's biennials. Perennials are kind of like your ever living type of plants. And so they're able to come back every year, or they're able to go through the hard conditions of coldness and then come back vibrantly in the warm conditions. So that's your perennials. And then if you're planting a lot of, like, let's say you have a seed source where you don't know how long they've been there, and you don't know if they're, viable, meaning they're able to germinate, you can plant like 5 to 10 in one little hole. And once they start sprouting, and let's say all of them come out like to 10, you can thin them out. And so that's where you're getting the smaller, thinner type of leaves, and you're only saving the bigger ones because they look more mature, they look more healthy, and they're able to do well in your soil. So the act of reducing extra seedings to that remaining plants that are spaced properly. And so that also helps in, making sure that all the nutrients in that one spot is not taking up by all those 10 plants. So maybe reducing them back to 5 or 3 is really good practice. And that's when we get into like dryland farming. Transplanting, like I was saying, transferring indoor plant seedling starts outdoor, and then planting directly into the soil. So transferring a plant to a different growing space. And then so a lot of the terminologies I found on this little website, botanicalinterest.com/product/garden glossary, or you can just look on Google and just like, if there's like words that you don't recognize on your seed pack and stuff like that, look them up. Like it doesn't hurt to kind of increase your vocabulary when it comes to gardening. And then knowing your plant cycles of growth needs. So before planting, know the plant cycle of growth conditions. So it's temperature, water, nutrients, and sunshade needs. As I explained earlier, understand what annuals, biennials, perennials for each plant are, and that will kind of help out your spacing and your area plantation, or planting in your garden or maybe your field. Send seed to flower of fruit. So knowing that stages or how long it takes is really going to do well, especially if you're starting a lot of your starts indoor. And then water needs will change, like I explained earlier. So having a good soil is where the work is mostly needed. If you really work on your soil, it becomes really like a sponge and holding water longer rather than it, soaking through or running off. If you had clay, you know what that looks like. If you care for the soil and replenish nutrients after every growing season, you will be okay. Like as long as you put back into the soil at the end of the growing season, you will do a lot better than you would if you didn't. Water needs for each plant will change, especially for stocky or big leaf plants. And that's where I'm talking about a lot of your corn or your squash plants. If you ever look at their leaf formation, that leaf formation really helps attract a lot of the sunlight, but also it takes a lot out of the ground when it comes to water. And then learn what areas, what are your water sources, if it's high in mineral water, like if you have a windmill that's high in salty water, you don't want to be using that a lot unless that's your only option. And so that's something that you would have to really look into. And then over time, like if you were to use that water continuously, you would just get this like white sud on top of the soil. And if that starts to build up over a capacity, then it starts to really affect the amount of porosity and nutrient salinity in your soil. So if you have increase in salt in your soil, then it starts to create a condition to where it's not compatible for a lot of plants, because salt draws out water and it dries out a lot of water type of condition. So, and if you've ever spilled a lot of salt accidentally in your soup, it becomes like really salty to the point where you don't want it. So it's kind of the same thing as plant needs. And then days to harvest. This is just a generalized layout that I put just for presentation sake, but this is will be indicated on your seed packets. Generally, seeds to harvest for each plant will be, corn 165, lettuce 45, squash 185, and these are just dependent on like the right conditions for each plant. So this is generally generalized, and so a lot of these have different varieties and subspecies, and so their needs and changes will vary. And then like if planting indoors, seed starts really benefits the amount of time that you're going to be saving, especially if you have a hoop house or if you have like conditions where your last frost season or date kind of goes into like mid-May and stuff like that. So let's say you're planting basil, but you wanted to plant before May, you would plant it like a month before indoor and then take care of it and then have it ready to transplant by May 20th. And so transplanting indoors really gives you a head start a month to a month and a half. And so this is just kind of general layout of that. And my rule of thumb is like when I'm growing indoors and I'm ready to transplant, I make sure that they're about 6 to 10 inches in length of height before I put them outside. But make sure you go through that hardening phase before you put it directly in the ground. So some of these plants will grow within less than 2 weeks to 3 weeks, and then they're ready to be transplanted. But just make sure you keep an eye out on the conditions outside. And then one thing that I really practice lately is also looking at your smartphones information about the weather. Just looking at a few days up ahead, looking at what days will be really windy, what days will be dropping temperature, or what days will be really hot where you need to water a little more than other days. And let's say we're getting into the monsoon season where a lot of rain is more accessible due to the monsoon rains, and so on those days you wouldn't need to water because it's already done. But you would kind of just estimate, like, did it rain enough to have it percolate down the soil, or did it just like get the topsoil in the wet? So if it just got topsoil wet, you would have to still water. And so that would kind of be an observation that you do during the monsoon season. But also just some notes to take from this is just to keep a record book for your garden of where you got your stuff, how much was it at the time, how much you needed for your little area, what tools you bought, and what the prices were for that and so forth, especially when it comes to soil amendments. And then when you planted, where you planted, and then label what you planted, especially if you grow a lot in a big area and you don't know where you planted or what you planted, it's gonna be kind of hard to determine that, and you'll have to wait until the plant like develops later on. And sometimes you'll plant in an area where you might have planted already. So that's where I'm saying, know where you planted and label what you planted. So those are one of the big things. And then once a plant gets to about 6 inches, more water is needed. So that's where you need to increase the amount of water you give it based on the type of plant you have. And that's the needs for that is going to change between big leaf plants to smaller leaf plants. So it'll really vary. Look out for bugs or any animals that may eat your vegetables or fruits. So that's where pest management comes into play. If you know you're in an area where a lot of rabbits or rodents come into play, then you're going to do a bottom lining of your fencing with chicken fence. And that just helps them keep out a lot of those rodents so that they don't eat a lot of your little plants that are. I went through that one year. I don't want to go through that again. And then first year will be a success with many challenges. Like I said, just keep a record of what you did, how you did it, and the next year you'll go back to your notes, and some things you'll forget. But then when you read your notes, you'll be like, oh yeah, this is right. Like, and then that's where you'll start to change out like what you need to do or improve on. And then, you will learn as you go. Like I said, I've been actively grower for the past 5 years. I've been improving ever since. Last year was the best growing season that I've ever had. And that's just a lot of trials and errors that I went through. But, don't give up and keep at it. As long as you have a goal to shoot for, it will always be improving. So thank you. And were there any questions specifically that me or Benita could answer?
Thanks, Darrell. And yes, we do have some questions. So go ahead and if you could stop screen sharing. Yeah, that's awesome. We did have some questions from our viewers, and I'll go ahead and just read through some of the things that were listed in our comment section. One of our viewers said that she's buying a shade screen for her plants to avoid sunburn or really harsh direct sunlight. What are some alternatives that you guys might recommend for shade cover? She says last year some of her plant leaves ended up kind of burning in her growing season. So do you guys have any recommendations on that?
There's multiple there's multiple items that they could utilize. Go to your local Home Depot store. There's a lot of sort of like screen mesh things that are available. There's multiple colors. They have it in green, black. For the bigger like hoop house that are 30 by say 100, we usually go to Farm Tech or Farm Co to place those orders in and get those purchased, just because they don't have that size and quality at local hardware stores. But if you have a small area, you can find that at any of the hardware stores around here. Like even a screen, like a screen mesh works well. Just make sure that the post that you're holding it with or whatever you're binding it down with is pretty sturdy.
Awesome.
Yeah, just to add to that, maybe you could also do companion planting, where if you have a really sensitive type of plant and plant like another type of plant that's next to it to kind of offer that shade structure. Like let's say you have a plant that you planted and it really loves sunlight, but it doesn't love a lot of it. And so in the summertime, a lot of the hot conditions really happen from 2 all the way down to 5 p.m. And so, looking at it in the sense of direction, you plant that sensitive plant on the east side of your garden, and then you have a plant that's really like sun loving on your west side. So that way it'll kind of keep out that really harsh conditions during that time. So that's where companion planting really help out in that too as well.
Awesome. Wow, good info. We have another viewer who says that this is going to be her first year starting a garden, and that she remembers her grandparents growing squash and pumpkins, potatoes. So one of her questions, and just in terms of kind of a comment, is that she's thinking about planting in about a 20 by 20 plot on new ground. So what she's asking is like, in terms of like maybe utilizing this new ground mixed with soil from Home Depot, is that a kind of like a preferable thing to do?
I think when we're talking about that size of 20 acres, I think, if you want fast accessibility, work with whatever you have, work with a lot of the amendment. But if you have a lot of local growers or a lot of local sources of manure or maybe composters, I would kind of go with local source type of ingredients or amendments. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Benita.
Yes, so you're saying, I think it says 20 by 20 feet.
I think it might be 20 feet, yeah.
Yeah, so that's pretty, small and workable. So I think you can add in, definitely adding in some soil amendments right off, and that's a lot quicker. But when you go to Home Depot, try to mix it up. Like, they sell steer manure, they sell different types of topsoil. They also sell the potting soil mix. So you might want to mix some of those up. There are little tiny, so like if your sand is really like, your soil is really sandy or is really clayey, depending on what you might have, you might want to add a certain type of soil to that. There's vermiculite, that's sort of like little cushiony, they look kind of like cottonseed. They can add like aeration to your soil. So if you're seeing like compaction, that might be something that you want to add. And it's also moisture retaining, so it helps absorb moisture and hold moisture. So there's things like that you could add in. They also sell that vermiculite just itself in a bag, if that's what you want to add in as a part of that. So there's different types of things that you can incorporate.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for those suggestions, guys. Also, another question is, how do you preserve your own compost? Maybe some suggestions in terms of optimizing composting.
Compost is a big topic in itself, and there's different types of composting when you really get into it. But there's thermal composting that will take around 6 to 8 months. But that's really if you really take care of it. But that's just different layering of like manure, your cardboard or your native soil with maybe straw bale, hay, or grass clippings, if you can include that. So like doing like a big old cage in that, like I don't know, like a 4x4 type of cage thing, or horse fencing, and then put it in like a circular formation, and then add those different layers at a time, and then making sure that every layer gets like moistened pretty well. And then kind of leave that sitting, have it covered with the tarp. It'll break down, and then you'll have like compost in that sense, and that's what you call thermal composting. And then when you get into like a lot of your household composting, like your kitchen scraps, just to make note that you only want your vegetable-based type of materials in that only. You're not going to want any animal products. But I make an exception for eggshells because calcium is one of the nutrients that a lot of plants need, and that goes to their root formation as well as some of their leaves formation, depending on the plant you have. So that's where you get a lot of your leafy greens, and make sure that when you're doing kitchen composting, that you don't include anything that was cooked with oil or grease or fat or any type of meat products. Or let's say you're eating a salad and you have a dressing that was with ranch. You don't want to be putting in with that because ranch is a has animal products in it. So making sure that your kitchen scraps is in there. So when you're doing kitchen scraps, making sure that you have a good carbon nitrogen, I guess, equality in there. So making sure that you have enough nitrogen, meaning whatever leafy greens you have in there or vegetables, and then put in like maybe let's say your paper shreds or your cardboard shreds, or even like shredded up straw bale hay, putting those in each layer, and that'll help kind of absorb the moisture that's decomposing, but also it'll keep the smell down. So when you have a smelly compost, that means you're not allowing aeration to have into that, and that gets into the nitty-gritty details about good bacteria as opposed to bad bacteria. So if you have a compost that really smells bad, like like decomposing or like really foul smelling, that comes from a lot of the anaerobic bacteria, which don't need oxygen. And so one way to kind of reduce that is turn it around and adding in a bit of your newspaper or your cardboard, stuff like that, and that'll be like your carbon absorbers. But also when you're churning and stuff like that, you're allowing aeration to get access to all of the inside compost, and so that's where you start to get into your good bacteria. And so you'll keep doing that every week. I would say weekly churning is a safe practice for composting. And then once you get to a consistency where it's like it smells good, like when you pick up a pile and you smell it and it smells like refreshing in the sense that it's like wet dirt, then that's when you start to have good compost. And then there's also like worm casting is another one too. Worm casting is like the most beneficial, most nutrient dense type of composting that you could have out there. So if you can find a resource that has worm compost, go with that. I would go with that a lot better than opposed to manure composting. I'm not like saying there's anything bad with manure composting. It's just kind of, it gets tricky as far as like nutrients and I guess accountability when it comes to like different bacterias and little microorganisms. But worm casting is like the best option, safest as well.
Okay. So just in terms and kind of reflecting on some of the things that you're saying here, let's say that let's say that I'm composting food, veggies from my house, and also eggshells. And I'm using a straw hay to kind of mix in so that I can aerate. How long does that necessarily, and then you kind of talked about, preparing it and having it ready, taking maybe 6 months. Is that about the normal window of time to get it to where it needs to be before you, have it in your fields?
So if you're working on it consistently for like, let's say you started it and like you're collecting everything during the summer and then you're doing pretty good. In the winter months, you wouldn't do it as often because it does get cold and you don't want your, I guess, good bacteria to get cold. And so you would kind of leave it dormant until like when it starts to warm back up, and then that's when you would start churning it. Kitchen composting takes from about 8 to 12 months, I guess. So it's a little bit longer process when it comes to like, I guess, normal composting. And when I say thermal, that's only manure based because there's a lot of nitrogen in that. And when you get a lot of nitrogen in with a lot of your composting, it rises the core temperature up. And so it starts to heat up over like 150 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you want to keep that thermal composting below 170. Otherwise, you start to really get into the area of ash. And so I guess that's just the differences between like regular composting and then thermal composting. Is just the time differences, but also the temperature differences as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, we do have a few more questions, and it looks like we have about 5 minutes left. So I'm just going to kind of go through some of the other things that people have been asking. What veggies grow best in a greenhouse? And are there any tips in general for greenhouse growers, small greenhouse growers?
I think based
Go
on
ahead.
experience and watching folks do that is a lot of the salad greens and the herbs, because they're quick growing and you can harvest it pretty quick and get some more starts going. Also, as Darrell mentioned, a lot of it is used for a season extension, like a hoop house. So growing, like your starts ahead of time so that you're able to transplant that, sooner. And they're a lot taller when you transplant. So I would think that's what, we have seen folks be a little bit more, I guess, savvy at growing a lot of the greens. You wouldn't want to grow, I mean, you can grow corn in there, but depending on the height of your hoop house, corn will grow pretty big, pretty tall, and so you might outgrow your hoop house. So I know a lot of folks are doing tomatoes, just because of the wind condition that we do have here too. So tomatoes grow well in the hoop house or greenhouse. Darrell, you can add.
Hoop house is a way different type of growing, I think, and it can be overwhelming when you're first starting in it. But I think some of the key factors that you really need to pay attention to is aeration, making sure you have daily aeration for the temperature, I guess, fluctuation. Because if you have it closed off and you have a really sunny day, it's really going to get hot in there, over 180 degrees. Or it can get that high. But if you have proper aeration to kind of cool down in there and keep it below 120 or something like that, it does really well. So having proper aeration, but also keeping your moisture at minimum. Because when you get into the area of high temperatures and high moisture conditions, you start to have a lot of pest problems. And that's where you're starting to get to aphids, your micro, spider mites, and a lot of the other fungus or bacteria that really love those type of conditions. So if you have proper aeration and you have your minimal moisture levels, not above like what needs to be in there, then you're gonna have a lot of those problems fixed. And then also making sure that if the varieties of plants that you have in there can grow in those high conditions. And then also maybe thinning back a lot of the leaves that are on the understory, because those understory leaves are really where a lot of the moisture is kept and where a lot of the warmth is also close to the soil. And that's where you start to get into creating the conditions and living areas of like aphids and stuff like that. So thinning back, proper aeration, I guess medium moisture levels in the soil, and also keeping on top of your pest management in between. It's really going to help you in the area of hoop house growing. But also some plants that grow well in there, like Benita was saying, a lot of your leafy greens, so like your lettuce, chard, kale, different varieties of those are there, options. Tomatoes really do well in hoop houses, and your chilies are also another one. Chilies really love hot conditions, and I've heard that the harder you have them, the harder they will be when you harvest them. So if you're not a jealous type, then you'll have those hot chilies in your hoop house.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Just have a couple more things, and just for reference, I think that if anybody has questions, you can Google Dine College Land Grant Office. I know Benita's email and contact is there. Maybe we could put it in our comment section for both of you guys if you're agreeable, so that people might be able to reach out. There was a question about how heat affects the plants you grow, but it does seem like you talked about that just in terms of the hoop house and kind of trying to keep the conditions around 120 or lower than that. Let's say we're talking about just a regular field. How do harsh harsh temps, higher temps, and more direct sunlight affect our plants. I mean, I would, you kind of think that, well, it's good to have sunny days because, we need the sun for the plants, but is there some detriment to that as well? Either of you guys can answer, it'd be awesome.
Yes, I think really paying attention to the types of plants that you are growing. Just as Darrell had mentioned, there's a lot of cool season and warm season crops. So your cool season crops, you want to have it in like a shady area or an area that has a little, not reaching those high temperature conditions. And if you're growing in a greenhouse, usually a greenhouse would be temperature regulated, so you're able to manipulate the temperature. But in a hoop house, things can definitely get really, really hot in there. And you can overdo the plants, meaning you start seeing wilting by the end of the day if you're not watering. You can lose everything in there if you don't even tend to it one day just because of how hot it is. So you have to really pay attention to that temperature. And as mentioned in a previous question, there's shade cloth. I know you can also do like a mini hoop house style over your crops and provide a smaller shade cloth just on some particular crops that are a little more, picky about making sure it's a little bit cooler or not, not too hot for them. So you can do small things like that. And what works well is if you go to like a hardware store and you buy the small skinny PVC pipes, and they sell them, I think, in 10-foot lengths, but you can put a rebar or a stake in the ground and you can just bend that and have that over. And you can do that with your crops throughout. And then you can cover it with shade. And most people, you can stake that down into your soil, or you can just add dirt on soil back on top of it just to make sure that it's not moving with the wind. You can clamp them down onto that. So there's multiple things that you can practice to help protect your plants.
Great. And I want to be respectful of your time. I want to close out, but one last, maybe you guys question that you guys could answer. Right now, currently, where we're at, May 4th, where should we be in terms of planting? Should we be starting to plant our crops or still preparing our fields? Just let our viewers know.
It's going to depend by the region, just because here, like I'm located in Saley, Arizona, it's pretty cold still in the morning, and I believe we've had snow before in June and May, so sometimes you plant now and you could lose everything to frost. So that's definitely sort of a challenge that you have, and you might not have that same issue in the Chinle Valley where you could have been planting a month ago or 2 months ago just because of how warm it is. But you think about the wind concerns. I was sharing with, I think, another group earlier this morning that we planted winter triticale on our fields, and next to our field, they're fallow farmlands, and our fields end up becoming sand dunes because we had forage on the ground, and that wind has just been bringing topsoil, and our field has been capturing other people's topsoil. So in our field, we have like sand dunes starting. And so we have to make the decision of whether we can still irrigate or we have to till everything back into the ground just because of how hard it is to manipulate the soil as it is right now. But that's definitely a huge issue. Having these high winds and moving our topsoil is definitely a huge challenge. And I think, when you just go across the reservation, you also see sand dunes occurring around people's houses or around their farmland, just because that's the only thing on the ground holding soil, and that's kind of capturing that there. So that's a challenge too, is the wind.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and then also to add on to the previous question, watering in general really determines like the success you have with your plants. And so during the summer is going to be really hard on a lot of your big leaf plants because, you know, like I said, they're going to get a lot of hit with that heat. They're going to hit with that sun and warmth and everything. But make sure that you always water during the evening hours is going to really help benefit your plants. Either morning or late evening hours, because that's when the conditions start to cool down and everything like that. So, and so that way you kind of stay away from that watering during the afternoon, because if you do that, it'll really affect your plants, because your plants are trying to uptake the water, but they're like so hot that they can't really do it properly. So during the morning and evening hours is the best time to do that.
Okay, awesome, man. Great discussion, you guys. I really appreciate you guys taking this hour and being able to be with our viewers today. Great, a wealth of information that was presented here today. And maybe sometime as we get a little bit further into the season, maybe we could do another follow-up, because I know you guys talked about adding fertilizers into the soil, you know, during the mid to later ends of the growing season, to kind of keep the crops, keep the nutrients in the soil for the crops. But I'd love to welcome you guys back again sometime and further our discussion. But for today, thank you. Appreciate you guys being here. I'm gonna go ahead and wrap us up today, and we hope to see you guys again. So hug on that.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you. Hug on it.